Hi, friends. You are listening to the EntreEd Talk podcast, where we feature amazing educators and entrepreneurs showcasing how you can bring entrepreneurship into the classroom. We believe entrepreneurship is for everyone. I am your host, Toi Hershman, and I am so glad you chose to join me on this journey. Let's go. All right. Welcome back, friends, to another amazing episode of the EntreEd Talk podcast. I am your host, Toi Hershman, and oh boy, do we have a special one for you today. I am delighted to be joined by my new friend, Dr. Rebecca White. She is an experienced educator, entrepreneur, speaker, author, and we'll talk about her book here in a bit, consultant and distinguished board member with expertise in innovation and talent development, design, management, and leadership. Rebecca is the James W. Walter Distinguished Chair of Entrepreneurship, a professor of entrepreneurship, and director of the John P. Lowth Entrepreneurship Center at the University of Tampa. That is a lot of times for me to say entrepreneurship. Rebecca also received her MBA and PhD from Virginia Tech University, in addition to starting several business ventures and launching nationally ranked academic careers. She grew up in a family business and has helped countless entrepreneurs launch and grow their companies. Her podcast, In Factor, and its companion blog share inspirational stories of successful entrepreneurs focusing on opportunity, recognition, and resilience. Welcome, Rebecca. We are so delighted to have you today.
Thank you, Toi. It is truly a pleasure to be here. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. And you're right, entrepreneurship it's difficult to say and spell, and especially if you have to say it over and over again. So thank you for that.
So this is great. We are so excited. But folks, this is going to blow your mind. So I am so over the moon today to have a co-host. It's been a while since I had a co-host, and it is our own Executive Director of EntreEd, Dr. Jean Coulson, who is joining us as my co-host. Jean and Rebecca go way back, and they share that Virginia Tech connection as well. So I know this is going to be a wonderful conversation. So welcome and thank you to you both. We are very excited about this.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here with you two ladies. This is such a treat for me.
This is going to be great. So thank you both. And Rebecca, before we dive in, can you please start us off by sharing with our audience a little more about your journey and how you got to where you are today? And please feel free to delight us with as much as you would like.
Thank you, Toi. And Jean, it's a delight to be here with you as well. Well, you did a really nice job on the intro, so I don't have to spend a whole lot of time here. But I grew up in West Virginia, rural West Virginia. And as you mentioned, went to Virginia Tech. I've lived in Cincinnati, Ohio for about 15 years and am now at the University of Tampa. And what's interesting for me is that where I am today is kind of the work that I've been doing all my life has kind of brought me back home. So and I know we're going to talk about my book here in a little bit, but I grew up in a family that where my mom was really my entrepreneurial inspiration. She has a great name. Her name's Betty White. And so I always like to share that with people. She was an artist. And sometimes when I'm speaking, I share some of her paintings and you can see the signature line. And I say, yes, my mom's Betty White. And everybody gets a big kick out of that. And she's not necessarily the Betty White of celebrity fame that most people think of, but she was a celebrity for me and in my little hometown. She was always the innovator, always got things done, always curious, truly had an entrepreneurial mindset and was way ahead of her time. And so I learned a lot of what I ended up teaching, from her. And so the entrepreneurial mindset was something I learned along the way. She was also a businesswoman. She had her own she was a florist. And so I grew up in that business. And at that time, we didn't have the competition from that now a lot of florists have from grocery stores and big box stores. But we did, we had a thriving little business there in Southern West Virginia, and I grew up in that, and I learned a lot about business from her as well. I went to Concord University, which is at that time it was Concord College, small school in Southern West Virginia, and worked along the way. Worked for an engineering firm for a while, and then went back and got my PhD, got an MBA and then a PhD, and immediately out of my PhD program for Virginia Tech, I went to Northern Kentucky University, and my PhD was in strategy, but I always had this interest in small firms. So a lot of my research was in the areas of small firm, and at that time we were calling it small business, not so much entrepreneurship. But when I came to Northern Kentucky University, they asked me if I would teach a course in entrepreneurship after I got sort of settled in. And so I taught graduate and undergraduate strategy, and then got involved in building an entrepreneurship program there. And I had done some of this previously. I failed to mention, I also taught at Concord for a while before I went back to get my PhD. So I had been engaged with the Small Business Development Center, and just really had this interest in entrepreneurship. And at the time that I was doing this, it was really entrepreneurship education was really growing. So it was about the .com era. And so I got involved in fundraising, and even before I was tenured, which a lot of my senior faculty thought was quite risky, I got involved in program building. So my academic career has really been around building entrepreneurship education programs. And, I've been at a number of schools, but most notably at Northern Kentucky University, and then here more recently at the University of Tampa. Actually, it's been 12 years. I did take a sabbatical a number of years back and started a company called Risk Aware, along with a co-partner, Stephanie Hughes. And Stephanie still runs that business. And she has a background. She was in the CIA and had a strategy background. She was a fellow educator at Northern Kentucky University. And we saw a market opportunity. And I can go in, there's a lot more detail there, but I'll just mention we saw a market opportunity and started a risk mitigation company for higher education. Some of the fun facts about that, we both became private investigators licensed by the state of Kentucky because we started with background checks, and then we built a software called Red Flag to help universities identify nefarious kinds of behavior and issues maybe that they may need to look at that are going on campus. And in 2007, this was around 2004 and 2005. And you might remember, I'm sure Jean does, in 2007, there was a horrible incident at Virginia Tech where many souls, I think it was 32 souls were lost, a student shooting. And so our business really gained traction at that time. And so it was some really, I learned a lot more about entrepreneurship through that experience, and decided, I wasn't the right person to run that company. And so Stephanie's running it, and learned a lot from that. And it was really a lot of fun to do that. Today, I'm building programs, just written a book, and have a podcast. And so just all things entrepreneurship. So long story.
It is wonderful.
What a marvelous background story. You've just done so much in so many geographic regions, and some of it pretty close to me and close to my heart. And then just so much you've done in your professional life. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you, Jean. It's been a joy.
So tell us about this book. You have a book called See, Do, Repeat, The Practice of Entrepreneurship. So this is exciting, and this recently came out. So I'd love for you to share more about your book and some of the major findings that you've had, and what your experience was like creating a book.
Yeah, it actually was, we used to have to report when we went back to school what we did on our summer vacation. So this is what I did with the pandemic, actually. It's a book I've been wanting to write for a while. And I know a lot of listeners to this podcast are educators. So we all went through a major transition. And we learned a lot about technology, but what the pandemic, as sad and tragic as much of it was, it afforded at least many of us an opportunity to do some of the things maybe that we hadn't been able to do because we didn't have some of the meetings and some of the other kinds of evening events and activities and things that take up so much of our time. So this was a book I'd been wanting to write for a while. I've spent probably the last 10 years looking at entrepreneurial competencies. And about 10 years ago, I started asking the question of, what is it that an entrepreneurship graduate should know? In most fields, it's pretty clear what a graduate should be able to do and how they're going to apply it. But in our field, we have, at least early on, we always measured it by how many of our students started businesses, but we think much more broadly now. We know it's much broader than that. It's more about a mindset and the application of these principles in virtually any context. So for me, competencies became a way to start to understand and define, and then actually set up methods to measure what our students are learning. So I was introduced to the idea of competencies by Kevin Moore. And when we started the program at the University of Tampa, we were afforded the opportunity to hire a practitioner to come in and work with us. And I actually recruited Kevin, who was a friend of mine in Cincinnati, but also one of the founders of Tier 1 Performance Solutions. And they're an ed tech company that actually created the first iteration of our red flag software for risk aware. So Kevin grew up on the water. It didn't take a whole lot to convince him. He was near the point that they were close to exiting their company, and he wanted to come to Tampa and or be near the water. So he and his family moved to Tampa, and he helped us build what we've been doing here at the University of Tampa. And his background was in this whole area of competencies, identifying competencies and building educational programs around them. So he really taught me a lot about that. I was able then to apply some of the education literature to what we're doing in entrepreneurship. And, over the last 10 years, really spent a lot of time studying entrepreneurial competencies. I wanted to take all the things that we were learning and talking about in the academic community and turn it into a book for practitioner, for the practicing entrepreneur and the emerging entrepreneur. So create a popular press book. So this was my first popular press book, and it's a very different kind of writing. I know, Toi, you're a book author also, so very different kind of writing from academic writing, and I really loved it. But it's really about the 3 competencies of entrepreneurship. And those are the ability to recognize opportunities, that's the C, the willingness to take action, that's the do, and the resilience to execute past failure. And that's the repeat. And I used a lot of stories from my own experience, but even more recently from my podcast to illustrate those 3 competencies. And so, when we talk about competencies, each competency has certain skills and abilities associated with it. So the book is really designed around that. There's three parts, and it's the 3 competencies, and then each competency has 3 skills associated with it.
It's awesome. I absolutely loved the book, and I like the part where you give so much great content and information and share these stories, but then you tell me what to do. So if I'm an entrepreneur, I'm like, okay, this is wonderful. It's great. But now this is how I actually go apply this thing. And I think it is wonderful. And it's a great, great read. I'd love could
I
share.
have a comment or maybe a question that'll lead to something. Having been in education for all of my life, and most of it in career and technical education, competency-based education is something that I've known about for decades. But in reading the book, you get to the three parts of competency-based education, and then I find that entrepreneurship is different because you don't get to mastery as that third step. And when I read that, it just kind of blew my mind a little bit that, hey, this is something different here. Can you talk about why mastery is a little different in entrepreneurship?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gene, because as you point out, entrepreneurship is not about mastery. And if we all had to master it before we took that first step, I don't think anybody would do it. And in fact, one of the things I've heard over and over from many entrepreneurs is if they had known what it would take, they weren't sure they would have ever taken that first step. So, it's a really interesting phenomenon, I think, when you think about it. The reason that I like to point out that it doesn't require mastery is because, otherwise, I think nobody would take that first step. So when you think about learning and competencies, there are various levels. So there's knowledge, and that's the most basic level of learning. And then there's application, which is what most of us try to share with our students, and we try to help them learn to apply what they're learning. But mastery is a whole other level. And so, the idea that you don't have to master all of the skills necessary for success in entrepreneurship, I think opens up the door for taking that first step. And, the other really important thing to remember is that entrepreneurship is not a solitary activity ever. There's usually somebody who, is the face of the entrepreneurial effort. But in every entrepreneurial effort that I've ever explored, studied, been involved in, it's much more of a team activity than most people realize. So the point is, you don't have to master everything, but you need to have an understanding of what it takes, and you need to surround yourself with people that can fill in the gaps.
That is great. I have a continuation of that question. You talk in your book about self-efficacy and that building that self-efficacy so that somebody will take action. And I think that that's a big sticking point. There was a quote in there that was so cool. And I apologize because I didn't remember who said it, but it was, everyone who has ever taken a shower has an idea. It's the person who gets out of the shower, dries off, and does something about it that makes a difference.
Yeah.
And I love that concept. I love if you talk a little bit more about self-efficacy and how you might encourage that, because that's usually the part where people get stuck, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, as we all know, the idea is only a very small part of a successful entrepreneurial venture. And we all have ideas. A lot of people have more ideas than others, but it's the people that act on them that actually, have an outcome. So self-efficacy is interesting. So the willingness to act, that second competency, I divide that into three different areas, and I think of it in terms of effectuation theory. So who you are, who you know, and what you know. And so who you are gets at that whole self-efficacy question. It also gets obviously at your interests and your background, but self-efficacy, I think of self-efficacy as self-confidence with some knowledge. So self-confidence is your belief in yourself. And of course, self-efficacy starts there, but self-efficacy starts with some self-confidence. But it also is bigger than that. It's knowing something and still believing that you can reach your goals, that you can achieve what you're trying to achieve. So it's more defined than just basic self-confidence. So when you think about how you can help build self-confidence, I think about two primary approaches, although there are probably many others. One is through inspiration and education. So, there's mastery experiences that we put people in where they learn about the specifics, they're inspired by people, and then they have an opportunity to apply it. So, to build that self-efficacy, people need to have some experiences around it. And I think mastery experiences is one of the best ways to do that. And of course, we do that all the time in entrepreneurship with incubators and accelerators and through our educational programs, through a lot of the work that you all do, so I think, role models are another great way. And, there's been a lot of research that looks at role models and looks at the impact that family members and friends who are, and teachers can have in terms of building self-efficacy. And of course, having a positive attitude is really important. I was listening again today to one of the podcasts from one of my former students, and he's built an amazing business. I talk about it in the book. His name's Ed Carey, and he's a social entrepreneur, and it's one of the first stories I tell. But, there was a great quote. He said, Dr. White, I don't have the luxury to be anything but optimistic. And, I think that entrepreneurs have to have a positive, anybody that's going to do anything has to have a belief that the future is going to be positive. So those are some of the ways I think, inspiring and experience, something around those two are how we do it.
Well, we know that you've worked most of your life with higher education at that level. Here at EntreEd, we work more often with the K-12 arena, and we talk about role models as well, because when we go through K-12, we see those students that have parents who are entrepreneurs. They get this. It's not a challenge to them particularly. They understand what it's about. But one of our challenges is how to take kids who don't know any entrepreneurs, who don't have any in their family or their next door neighbor, particularly where we work a lot in rural Appalachia. How do you explain a role model or portray a role model to somebody in that sort of a situation?
That's a great question, Gene. And I think it gets to the point that we need to find role models that our learners can relate to. So that, as an educator, sometimes we have to dig a little deeper to find those. It's one of the reasons I started InFactor, quite honestly. I started it prior to the pandemic, but during the pandemic, it became a great tool to use in the classroom when we couldn't bring guest speakers in. Right. So, I think pairing them with coaches and mentors and finding materials, case studies, podcasts, other kinds of stories that these students can relate to is one of the most important jobs that we have as educators. Many times we are their role models as well. And, I think that there's a lot that we can do, to really help connect the dots for them in terms of their ability, reminding them of times that we see them, demonstrating positive behaviors and reminding them of experiences that they've had, helping them connect the dots. Because sometimes my students won't even recognize that some of their experiences that they've had are really mastery experiences that have prepared them for what they need to be doing. For example, sales is so important in entrepreneurship. You got to be able to sell. And, a lot of our students, when we talk about, what kind of experiences have you had? when they go back and look at it, they realize that maybe they worked at the Best Buy and they gained some selling experience, or they had part-time jobs or internships where they learned how to sell. So just helping connect the dots for them, I think, and then finding role models that they can relate to, digging those out.
I like the idea of using the podcast, because that is something that our students do. At
Yes.
least our older students, that fits right into their being and mindset.
Yep, exactly. You got to meet them where they are.
Right.
I love the idea of it. We talk a lot about experiential education and how important it is for them to when you talk about self-efficacy and building up those experiences, so that when they're in the real world, it's not different. It's something that they're used to, and they have that confidence, that self-efficacy to feel like, I think I can do this, and I think I know how now because I've had that exposure. You talked too about networking in the book, about how there's a fine line, kind of a balance there, where do you want to go out and go to all of these different events and things and meet as many people as possible? And then one of the comments in the book was, then you come back and you have all of these contacts and you don't know what to do with them, or do you want to put your head down and focus on being an entrepreneur? And I love if you could kind of talk about the balance between those two things.
Yeah, it's always a balance. And, I think I mentioned some quotes in my book, about the importance of opportunities, and the importance of networking and how opportunities tend to come from that. But at the same time, it's important to know what to say no to. So that's probably one of the things that I see with a lot of the entrepreneurs and the student entrepreneurs, and even the young entrepreneur, the non-student entrepreneurs that I've worked with, is trying to figure out that balance. It's a lot of it is about having a strategic plan for networking. So networking strategically, I like to call it. And that's really important in terms of understanding what you're trying to accomplish. Now, that said, I think when you go into a networking experience, there can be a lot of things that come from that you're not anticipating. So I'm not really suggesting that you narrow it down, but I think you need to think about it strategically. And that means understanding what your goal is, what you're trying to accomplish, what you're looking for, and maybe even working with coaches and mentors to identify the kinds of people that you need to network with. It's not just, can I, amass, the more names I amass, in my network, the better. I know from a social media perspective, it's really important to get those numbers up. But from an in-person kind of networking experience, it's more about building relationships. And sometimes, it takes a while for those relationships to get built. And I remind my students a lot of times it's not all about them all the time. So, they'll go into a networking experience and be very nervous. So they talk too much and they talk about themselves, or they want to pitch their idea to everybody they see. And so it's sort of teaching them to think about networking as building relationships. And it's true, we all understand that networks are one of the most important things for an entrepreneur. It's where we access talent. It's where we access information. There's a lot of tacit information, things that are shared that are not explicitly described or talked about, that come out of those kinds of experiences. So they're really, really important, but we need to do it strategically, and we need to understand why we're doing it. And if possible, we need to do it with the assistance of someone coaching us on, who is it that we need to network with. One of the things that I include in I came out with a guidebook to go with the book, but I have an exercise for entrepreneurs to develop a matrix and just basically identify all the kinds of skills and information that they're seeking out at the time. And of course, it's going to change over time. And then just to, in just a simple spreadsheet, put all those across the top, and then down the side, start to list some of the names of people that you'd really like to connect with, or types of people that you'd like to connect with that can help you, bring you closer to getting to those skills. So there's some real practical ways you can do it if you just put a little time and energy into strategizing around networking.
Love that idea.
I've discovered, and I've spoken recently about it a couple of times, about the importance of having the right partners on the right project. And that all comes from networking. Some of the right partners for a project today could be a networking contact you made 2 or 3 years ago. And you said, yes, we need to work together. We have things in common. We have similar beliefs, but we don't have a project to work on just yet. And those things come around later. And when I got to the part in your book about the networking, I said, this is right on target, right on target.
That's a really good point, Jean, because, sometimes we think that people are just lucky, or that it's serendipity, that they can connect or meet with the right people, but it's really putting yourself in the right place, building those relationships, and then being able to recognize when it's time to act on that relationship. I really like that you brought that up. I think that's real important.
Well, heck, that's why we found you on the podcast.
That's right. We reconnected after many years, Jean.
So that's perfect example. Oh, Rebecca, I'd love to get your opinion on this kind of abstract term that we call entrepreneurial mindsets, and what that means to you, and how that applies in your career and in your teaching.
Really good question, Toi. We talk about entrepreneurial mindset, and that's kind of, again, what led me down this path of trying to figure out what the practice of entrepreneurship really is. And so if you think about it, the practice of entrepreneurship is taking that mindset and putting it into action. So I definitely believe that there is a mindset, an entrepreneurial mindset, that there's been since about the year 2000 when we first started talking about mindset. There's been a lot of talk about mindset. There have been courses, programs. There's a lot of people that suggest that they've got the secret to entrepreneurial mindset, but I don't think that we've really, really clearly defined it. In many ways, especially those of us who are doing research in that space. There is an entrepreneurial mindset profile that's been developed by some good friends of mine out of Eckerd College that many people have used in the field. I've used it quite a bit, and I think it gets at a lot of what an entrepreneurial mindset is. But I also I believe that entrepreneurial mindset is it's a way of looking at the world through this entrepreneurial lens. And it's, when I first started on this book, I thought it was going to be about entrepreneurial mindset. But what it really became is how we can put that into practice. So entrepreneurial mindset, like I said, there's been a lot of varying definitions of it, but it's a combination of this, ability to recognize opportunities, being forward, future oriented, forward thinking, optimism, I think, is a part of it. Self-efficacy and self-confidence are typically a part of it. So, like I said, I really see do repeat this model as taking that mindset and putting it into practice.
Yep, that is a really great way to sum it up. It's always a difficult thing because you can just keep adding mindsets to the
right.
But it's really important when if somebody builds up some of these amazing mindsets, it will help them no matter what they end up doing. And we like to
explain that to our educators too. And, well, even if this person doesn't become an entrepreneur, those skills, those mindsets are still going to help that person no matter what they end up doing in life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's, Carol Dweck, I think, wrote about the growth mindset, and, there's a lot of similarity there, I think, to it, to the growth mindset. And, I think the most important thing is not whether or not we've gotten it completely defined, but more importantly, that we are recognizing its value, as you pointed out, in a wide variety of contexts. And, I do a lot of consulting work with corporations. I know you mentioned I'm on a public company board now. I've been on other company boards, and, regardless of the organization's size, this idea of this ability to recognize entrepreneurial opportunities and take ownership, which is what the entrepreneurial mindset is all about, is highly valued. Whether it's starting your own business or in a corporation or in a not-for-profit or with any kind of project or any kind of experience, I can say that, all of my work has been very entrepreneurial, even though I've been inside of a highly bureaucratic field most of my life, as we all know education can be.
I've had entrepreneurship education on my business card for probably 40 years, all at the K-12 level. And it's been interesting to watch in talking about mindset, that when you talk to folks that are not entrepreneurship educators, you have to approach this mindset understanding that they're thinking about the nuts and bolts of starting a business, the small business management pieces. And that when you talk about entrepreneurship, and particularly when you get to mindset, that's really two very different things. And where in your higher ed experience do those nuts and bolts and small business management techniques come in along with your focus on the mindset?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jean. Initially when I first started teaching entrepreneurship, it was pretty much about what you're talking about, small business management. And, everybody would, we expected everybody to walk into the classroom with an idea. That was kind of like the first day, what's your idea? Now let's put together a business plan. And what do you need to do? What kind of research do you need to do? Who's going to be your target market? How are you going to communicate with them? How are you going to price your product? How many are you going to sell? Where are you going to locate? Those were the kinds of topics that we pretty much exclusively talked about. And I'm not at all suggesting that we should lose those, because I think those are really important. But I do believe that the entrepreneurial process is a learning process. So very early on, I kept thinking, when I was teaching, a lot of these students were teaching this to them, but they don't really need to apply it yet. So that they're not really learning it in the same way that the ones that are ready to apply it are learning it. And I saw this, I had a great, one good story about this. I had a great student at Northern Kentucky University. She was a photography major and an entrepreneurship minor. And I've always believed that entrepreneurship should be available to all students, all majors. And we were one of the first schools at NKU to really focus on that. And so she was in my capstone course where she had taken all of her courses. She was getting ready to graduate. She wanted to open a photography business, and she was going to, present her concept to, we brought in some investors, on the last day to give feedback. I walked down the hallway and she was standing outside crying. And she said, Dr. White, I can't open my business because I can't really afford to. When I finally ran the numbers and really started to understand how much time I had to spend processing and selling and, in meetings and doing all the business of having a photography business, there wasn't enough time for me to actually go out and shoot enough customers, get enough business to make money. So, that was the reality of what she was learning. She needed to learn that, obviously. Now, what happened was about a year later, 6 months later, sometime within the year, she gave me a call and said, Dr. White, I have an opportunity and I need you to remind me where to start. And so someone at her church had basically said, look, you can use this little storefront. It's empty. And I'd like for it to have a tenant in it. I'll let you use it free for a year to get your business up and running. It was a small, perfect spot for her. It was in a part of town that was actually a good part of town for her business. And so she was able to actually launch her business. So the difference was when she actually got out and she was practicing, what she was actually doing, what she had learned, things started to come together. And that's when she needed all the lessons that she was learning. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be teaching them, but I think what's most important is that we teach students how to find information, where to find information, how to surround themselves with the right people, how to be ready for failure, how to deal with challenges. Those are the things that'll get them through. They can learn a lot of the basics. They can learn a lot of what they need to learn when they're out practicing, because entrepreneurship is a learning process and it's an experiment. That's what I always tell my students. You're making a ton of assumptions. It's about, it's an experiment, and you're making a lot of assumptions and you're going out and testing them to see if it's going to work. So, I think we need to teach those basics. And in our program, we start by talking about mindset. We start by trying to prepare students actually for what it's going to mean to be an entrepreneur. We teach them those skills, and then we help them start to build their network even before they leave, so that they can reach back, or they can reach into the network that they've built to actually learn more about what they need to do on a day-to-day basis, because they're going to be learning every day.
That is so true. I like to always say you can't learn how to swim in the library.
Yeah.
We need that intersection of that experience plus the, need, the need to be able to have that knowledge. So you mentioned the F word, and I want to talk about that because it's my favorite one, the failure word. Can you share a little bit about how you encourage failure and this uncomfortableness with uncertainty, and also resilience in the face of it all?
That's a really, really good question, and a really tough one. So, as you pointed out, we create a lot of experiential learning exercises and opportunities for students to learn through experience in all of our education programs. I know that's an important part of what you do, and it's an important part of what we do. But this whole one around failure is a really tough one. And, I had a kind of a life-changing experience with a student. I had a graduate student that was, we were having a really meaningful conversation about failure. And I was talking about the fact that, failure is part of the path, and that in entrepreneurship, we often recommend that you fail early and fail fast and fail early. And he was really offended by that concept. And he actually walked out of class after getting upset and dropped out of the program. And it really rocked me. I mean, I was very upset by that whole experience. I was never totally clear that it was that discussion. It may just not have been the right thing for him, but it was really pretty hard to see. And it made me realize that we probably in education are not doing a very good job of helping build resilience among our students. So I started thinking about this whole area of resilience and how we can build resilience, and about fear of failure and what that means. And in my book, I have a couple of chapters where I focus on those, both of those topics. And, resilience is closely tied to the whole self-efficacy thing that we were talking about. Because the reality is, if my mom used to always say, if you've never made a mistake, you haven't done anything. So, our students, and, I think they need to understand from stories and experiences that we can share through podcasts or through coaching and mentoring programs. They need to understand that failure is a part of it. And they need to think about how they actually define failure, because that, I think, therein lies the real transformation. Because when we think of failure as the end, then it is very, very challenging to deal with. But when we think of failure as an experience and learning what didn't work so that we can then move on to what does work, then we begin to really be able to transform the way we approach failure. So one of the things I think is most important is to have those conversations with students, to share examples, and then to also encourage them to take some steps that will put them into situations where they are not certain of the outcome, and where they might have to experience an outcome that isn't exactly what they wanted. And I think then we need to be there to help coach and mentor them through. Now, that takes a lot, and we'd love to be able to spend many, many hours with every student, but we don't have that. So the way we overcome that really is by setting up these programs, these experiential programs that include peer coaching, peer mentoring, coaching and mentoring by experts and experienced entrepreneurs. And so, just helping students talk through, their experiences and helping them know where to turn. And, I just had a young entrepreneur who's in our program come in and talk to me, and he was in tears and very upset over, the outcome of something that was going on. And, basically what I did was listen, and then I encouraged him to think about, the worst case outcome from that and how he would deal with that. And then I encouraged him to get some expertise, because there was the potential of a legal issue. So we were fortunate to have someone, an attorney who volunteers and gives some time to talk with them. So again, we create this ecosystem for them. And hopefully it provides sort of a safety net that allows them to experience failure on a smaller scale, so that when it's even greater, they can deal with it.
That's a great idea. I always wanted a T-shirt that said "Failure is an option."
Yeah. Yeah. I think Sarah Blakely, I was listening to a short podcast where she was talking about failure, and she said her father always said, the only failure was not trying. And I thought that was really good, and a good way to approach it.
Yeah, it really is.
Toi, do we have time for one more question?
We sure do.
I think we've kind of gotten out of order here, certainly in the order of your book. But I really enjoyed reading the part about all the steps to opening up your life and your mind before that light comes on and you get your idea. Building to that instead of expecting that to be step one.
Yep.
Can you talk about that just a little bit? I thought that was fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting, because I think a lot of us, until we talk about it, don't recognize that, the light bulb going off is not the beginning of an idea, of generating an idea. So yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I learned is that the students who had a meaningful opportunity to work on seemed to learn more about the skills necessary to be successful as an entrepreneur. So I really started to focus more on how I could help my students identify more opportunities. And, you know, really it is about connecting dots and connecting things that, you know, existed separately and bringing them together. And there is a process for that. And when you start to teach that process and share that process, it really starts to open up the world for our students, because they often don't have enough data points in their experiences to connect the dots to something that's going to be really meaningful and that's going to be able to add value. So the steps really begin with research. And that's something that our students oftentimes don't want to spend the time on. And so we really have to, I think, create ways to encourage them to learn more about what's going on around them and to experience things. It's why a lot of our students probably need to work first before they start a business, because they need to have some experiences. But there's lots of ways that we can open our mind to more information, because it's gathering that raw material. And you know, from a perspective of a new idea or an innovation, it's about gathering raw material that is specific to the problem that we are interested in looking at, as well as things that are general, not even related. Because remember, you know, an innovation really often comes from bringing together two things that were never connected. So, you know, people who are naturally curious, people who are interested in the world, they're going to come up with more opportunities, because that is that's what opportunities are built on. They're built at this intersection of bringing together all these different areas of interest and fields and things that you might learn about just if you pay attention to the world around you. So it starts by gathering all that data. Then your mind, you know, you have to spend some time on it and really work at identifying opportunities and ideas out of that, all the information. And so I always recommend things like keeping a journal and, you know, reflection and a lot of, you know, note taking to bring together information and just putting it somewhere and reflecting on it periodically. But then at the step that a lot of people don't realize is that you also have to give your mind time to process all this stuff. And the way we do that best is letting go of it. And, you know, coming up with the name for my book, for example, was a big challenge, because book names matter. And all the names I could come up with these long academic names that had words in them that nobody was going to be interested in particularly. But, you know, after I you know, looked at the problem, thought about it, kept a notebook on it, reflected on it, you know, worked hard, talked to my book publishers and others about it, I just said, okay, I'm going to let it go. And one of the ways that I am able to generate more ideas is I'm a runner. And so I always tell my students they need to do something that just lets them forget. You know, they're not focused on trying to solve the problem. And anything that can kind of bring you to that Zen state where you're kind of that flow state. Then, you know, so I was out running one day and the idea for See to Repeat came to me, and I just knew that was the right name. So there is a process and you can practice it. And I do talk about it in the book. And, you know, the idea then is it seems like it's the end point, but it's really just the beginning, because then from an entrepreneurial perspective, we have to see if we can add value to somebody through this idea. So it is, you know, I appreciate you bringing that up. I love that we can think about it in a process because I think for a lot of people, they just say, well, I'm not good at generating ideas. I can't come up with an opportunity. But life experiences will change that. And I tell some great stories, I think, in the book about some of my students and others for whom the connecting the dots came when they actually had some life experiences.
I just love the whole idea of getting to that point where you're sort of almost there and then just putting it away and doing something else and letting your mind chew on it a while and letting it come to you sort of organically after you've done the work.
Yep.
The idea of putting it away and not thinking about it for a while is not something that is natural to my thinking. And I thought that was just great.
Yeah, I think it's hard, especially, you're right. It requires a lot of work. You got to do the work. But once you do the work, if you understand the process, you can speed it up, I think, by giving your mind the chance to do what it will do, because our minds and bodies are amazing if we let them do what they're meant to do.
I love that. I love you use the term disconnect to connect, which I think is really cool.
Absolutely.
So we went from mindsets to mindfulness. This is great. I love that. That's how innovation happens, right?
That's right. That's right.
So cool. Well, I know Jean and I could talk to you for another 5 hours easily, but we are up on our general time frame. We like to kind of keep it at a normal drivable chunk of time. So, but I know I speak for Jean. We're so delighted and so grateful to have had you join us today. But before we go, I would love for you to share with everyone where they can find you, where they can find your book, where they can check out your podcast, and all of those great things.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a treat, and I've really enjoyed, as I always do, talking with you all, and love talking about this topic. So my book, you can find at seedorepeat.com, and that's just spelled out SEEDOREPEAT.com. And then Infactor Podcast, that's ENFACTOR, infactorpodcast.com. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, you can also find it on Apple, Spotify, on any of the main podcast platforms. I also have a blog on the website, infactorpodcast.com. So love to have you join me there. And then I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn. I'm Dr. Rebecca White. So, hopefully anybody can feel free to reach out, and love to connect that way.
Awesome. Well, I will make sure to include all of those in the show notes, so you don't have to go far, folks, to find it, but please do connect with Rebecca. She's an amazing person. This has been a wonderful opportunity to speak with her. And you need to read the book. It is really, really good. It is so helpful. So thank you for that. We are very grateful to have had you.
Thank you both.